Dramatic developments in Syria in recent weeks have dealt a major blow to Kurdish aspirations for self-rule. In a rapid military offensive, the Damascus government moved into northeast Syria and took control from the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, effectively ending the autonomy the Kurds had built during the civil war. The United States, which supported Syrian Kurds for more than a decade, did not intervene, and that silence speaks volumes. It suggests Washington now sees President Ahmed al-Shara and the Syrian transitional government as its primary partner in Syria, including in the fight against ISIS. For the Kurds, this feels like the end of an era and the beginning of a new, uncertain one. The Syrian uprising opened a historic window. A long-repressed and unrecognized minority began governing itself in the country's north. Their role in defeating ISIS earned them Western military support and diplomatic legitimacy. And their experiment in self-rule helped fuel Kurdish nationalism far beyond Syria's borders. So, what do these latest developments mean, not just for Syrian Kurds, but for Kurdish communities across the region? Will the rollback of Kurdish power in Syria weaken Kurdish nationalism or strengthen it? And what lies ahead for the Kurdish struggle for democracy and human rights? Welcome to Rethinking Democracy with Gönül Tol. On today's episode, we will unpack these questions with Dr. David Romano. David is a professor of Middle East politics at Missouri State University and has written extensively on Kurdish politics. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Oh, before we get into the latest developments in Syria, I want to take a step back and ask how we got here and why Syria became such a pivotal arena for Kurdish politics. I was in Turkey shortly after the Kobani protests in 2014, traveling with a few colleagues. ISIS was on the verge of capturing the northern Syrian town of Kobani, and the Kurds there were fighting desperately to hold the line. And it really felt like a historic turning point. And at the time, President Obama was urging President Erdogan to open Turkey's borders to Iraqi Kurdish forces so they could cross into Syria and help defend Kobani. But Erdogan dragged his feet and even almost seemed almost pleased, saying Kobani was about to fall, and that infuriated many Kurds and plenty of Turks as well, and it sparked these massive protests. So I remember, and then of course came the US decision to airdrop weapons to the Syrian Kurdish militia, and I remember traveling through Kurdish towns on the Turkish side of the border, speaking with just ordinary people, community leaders and Kurdish political figures. There was just so much optimism at the time, and many genuinely believed that this could become the Kurds' biggest breakthrough in generations. So I just want to ask you, first, do you remember that moment? And if we start from there, how did Kobani reshape Kurdish aspirations and Kurdish expectations about what might be possible?
I remember the period very well, and I think everyone needs to remember that until Kobani, ISIS was on a non-stop spree of victories. No one had managed to stop it. The Iraqi army had fled Mosul and left all their materiel there for them to capture. And for a lot of people in the immediate region, it kind of felt like they were unstoppable. And the fall of Kobani was a foregone conclusion. Not just Erdogan and other politicians in Turkey, but even in the U.S., we heard that it's done for. And then when Kurdish fighters with, very limited assistance, the airdrops were, of course, extremely important and so forth. But, this is just all them doing their own fighting, were able to break ISIS there. And then the airstrikes, those made a big difference. And ISIS's advance was broken. I think Kobani and all of Rojava became a symbol of, the Kurds' kind of plucky, dowdy refusal to fall in front of ISIS when so many others had. And then it opened up a space in Syria, the first real space free of both Assad and Islamists, Islamist extremists. And so I think you're absolutely right. There was very high levels of hope that, something different could be created. And for a long time, something different and positive was created. I'm not going to try to give a romanticized notion that, everything was perfect in the region of northeast Syria, but we had a fascinating experiment in an alternative political system there. It was Kurdish-led, but it was not exclusively Kurdish, and they bent over backwards, really, to incorporate other groups and whatever their ethnicity, whatever their religion. Where they were weaker, of course, was being more open politically to other political movements. That's where we were kind of looking at a one-party state, open to anyone of any ethnicity or religion and so forth. And I think in some sense this became a bit their Achilles heel, which we can speak about later. But for a long time, northeast Syria, the autonomous administrations there were the good news story from Syria, much like Iraqi Kurdistan for a long time was the good news story from Iraq.
Really interesting points you raised here. And I want to get back to what you said about how the Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Forces, ran the places that that were under their control. But before that, a few words about Kobani. It was once an irrelevant town, right? And then all of a sudden it became the symbol of Kurdish national aspirations, not just in Syria, but across the region. And I remember thinking at the time, Syrian Kurds had lacked the national symbols that mobilized their sisters and brothers elsewhere. Iranian Kurds had this short-lived Mahabat Kurdish Republic that was established in the 1940s. And then Iraqi Kurds had Halabja, right? The site of Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons attacks, which killed thousands of people. And now Syrians had Kobani. So
right.
that really was something. And I, at the time, when I was speaking with these Kurds, I could understand why they were so optimistic. Again, we will unpack all those, but I want us to now fast forward to what's been happening in the last few months. If you're in Syria, the fighting between Damascus, Syrian government forces, and the Syrian Democratic Forces escalated in early January. And government forces moved into Aleppo and seized two Kurdish neighborhoods. And then from there, the offensive quickly shifted east, pushing the SDF back beyond the river Euphrates. And a big part of why the SDF lost ground was the defection of these Arab tribal factions that you just mentioned. They had been part of the coalition, and many of them ended up cutting deals with Damascus. And some critics argue that actually the Syrian Democratic Forces didn't always govern the areas it controlled in a fair or genuinely democratic way, and that this alienated those local Arab tribes and made those defections more likely. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure there's anything that the SDF and the autonomous cantons could have done to keep the Arab tribes on board. Now, when we discuss this, we have to differentiate between the Arab tribes that the SDF recruited and was under pressure from the Americans to recruit quickly and bring into the movement, and individual Arabs or Assyrians or even Turkmen and others who joined the SDF or the YPG and the YPJ. I think those who joined as individuals have largely stayed in the movement. I haven't heard stories of defections, but with the tribes, the dynamic was different. I was in Rojava last year in I guess November 2024, and we knew then that the tribes, as a survival strategy, had members in every camp. You know, you have a tribal sheikh, and he's like, yeah, my son is in the SDF, and my nephew is with Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, and the other nephew was with Assad. The tribes just want to make sure they're on the winning side, and they go whichever way the wind blows. And they did the calculus, especially after the United States' envoy, Tom Barak, kept saying all his mantras, which could have come straight out of the capital of other states in the region, that Syria has to have a strongly centralized government, and federalism, decentralization doesn't work in the region. They saw which way the wind was blowing, and everyone was embracing al-Shara and his new government, despite a lot of problems and warning signs. And so the tribes tried to pick the winning side, and they defected. That was not a surprise. We a lot of us saw it coming. Did the SDF make contingency plans sufficiently to deal with that? No, I don't think they did. But you look at scholars like Fabrice Balanche in France. He was publishing articles saying the tribes were going to defect since a couple of years.
Yes, I mean, that certainly makes sense because, as you said, I mean, this was a coalition that was put together by the Americans. There was not this almost natural, it wasn't a natural, perfect match from the get-go, and it was mostly designed to allay Turkish fears that this was a YPG-led, YPG-dominated dominated group, although it was. So it makes sense. And one has to remember also this historical, the animosity between these groups, Kurds, Arabs, in this country. So that certainly that was a factor. And then also one has to consider Turkey has been trying to convince some of those tribes. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan recently said that Turkey has been working with these groups to make sure that they defect when Damascus launched this attack. So all that really makes sense. But going back to my question about, I mean, do you think there is any truth to this notion that the SDF could have done a better job in terms of including others in the places that they controlled? I mean, did some of their practices really alienate these other groups?
Yeah, well, the SDF was learning by trial and error in the early days when, you know, they would send a cadre to like Raqqa to lecture the people there, both tribal and non-tribal, about, proper gender relations and antiquated practices from the past that have to be abolished. You can imagine that did not go down well. And especially in a context, as you mentioned, of historic animosity between different groups. Like, the Kurdish movement that became the autonomous canton leadership, that became the PYD and the SDF and the YPG, it got its start in 2004, around then, when there was this football match between a tribe from, I think it was Kamishli and Deir el-Zor. And, that was violence for football fans, kind of representing each of their communities, with the Kurds chanting the name of George Bush and the Arabs chanting Saddam's name, and really trying to piss each other off severely. That's the context in which these communities living side by side had often found themselves. And that can't be undone overnight. And I think anyone would say that the SDF had and the PYD, the autonomous cantons, had made missteps with that. Like in Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa, they'll be like, "Who the hell are these guys to come and tell us how we're supposed to live our life?" And there was also the issue of you had to be within the political line of the autonomous cantons and the PYD about democratic autonomy. They didn't even open it up politically to even other Kurdish parties, much less other parties. Now, you can understand why they did that. They wanted to maintain their monopoly on the use of force within the area. They didn't want it to let neighboring states insert their proxies to cause them problems. But there was a price to be paid, and it was political isolation. And that price came due in the last couple of weeks.
It looks like the fighting has largely subsided for now after Washington helped broker a ceasefire. But what Damascus seems willing to offer the Kurds today is far less than what was on the table in the March 10 framework, which at least left room for some form of Kurdish autonomy. The latest deal for our viewers, it focuses more on integration than self-rule. It proposes folding Kurdish forces into state institutions, including the creation of a military division made up of 3 brigades of SDF fighters. And there's also, I think, a Kobani specific brigade under the Aleppo division. It's not what the SDF had originally wanted, but from their perspective, it's still an improvement over the harsher January 18th version, right? And I think the agreement also includes some political and symbolic concessions, appointing Kurdish officials to local and central government posts, potentially including the governor of Hasaka, and also recognizing Kurdish educational rights. But at the same time, Damascus would regain control over the oil fields, which deals a huge blow to the SDF. So my question here is, I mean, what was the Kurdish calculation here? And where did they miscalculate, if any? I mean, they miscalculate between the March 10 framework and where they have ended up now?
Well, I think especially Turkey was pressuring Damascus to present as centralized a program as possible. Damascus no doubt wanted that as well, and the Kurds wanted what they wanted. Now, part of the problem for the Kurdish side of this was that few outsiders understand exactly what they're asking for. It's not simple, the whole democratic autonomy and different arrangements. If they had just asked for federalism like Iraqi Kurds do, people understand that language. And there's nothing wrong with federalism, even if in the Middle East they misinterpret it as separatism and so forth. It's been one, to the extent that it's been practiced in Iraq, it's been one of the successes there. So there was misinformation regarding even what the Kurds were asking for, and sometimes even well-informed actors were unclear exactly what it was. Now, the oil fields, I think those were always something that was going to go to Damascus in the negotiations, as well as borders. The other stuff, especially the integration of the military forces, they've lost a lot of headway on that. They didn't get very much, and even the commanders of those 4 divisions, the 3 SDF and the 1 in Kobani, it's unclear that they're going to be SDF. And my worry is that wherever there's ambiguity, given the asymmetry in power right now, it will be worked to the disadvantage of those pushing for a genuine power sharing and compromise with Damascus. And they're going to whittle it away, much like Baghdad has done to Erbil, by the way. The autonomy was more robust before, but from Maliki's first term and then especially his second and then subsequent governments, it was whittled away to the point that, Baghdad controls everything related to the budget, it controls borders, and it can use that to undermine any substantive autonomy if it has a mind to. This looks like, in some ways, the plan for a very smart administration in Damascus to just slowly whittle everything away in Rojava. They've calculated that, it won't do them any good to have a massacre and so forth, which we're all thankful for, that, you get Lindsey Graham in Washington passing the Save the Kurds Act, and even Israel behind the scenes saying they're not going to accept a massacre. So I think the strategy for Damascus has become to just whittle it all away slowly with nothing headline worthy, but every day another chipping away at any genuine power sharing or autonomy there.
But you mentioned Israel. I guess that's what I wanted us to cover a bit when I asked, why did the SDF fail to implement the March 10 agreement? And I wanted to ask you whether Israel or Israeli presence in Syria played a role in Kurdish calculations. I mean, again, from my talks with Syrian Kurdish officials, there was always this vague expectation that Israel could deliver for Kurds what it did for Druze communities. I mean, to me, that was never a realistic thing, but yet there was still that expectation. So I wonder, what do you think? Do you think that also played a role in SDF's decision to drag its feet? To be sure, I mean, Damascus, by the way, I mean, March 10 agreement, they couldn't really move forward on that, and Damascus had its own mistakes there. But we're talking about the Kurds here. So, what do you think? Did Israel play a role there?
It's hard to say. When I was there as well, a bit more than a year ago, they were all asking me what I thought Israel's position would be. Would it be willing to help them? And the key issue here is it's a bit similar in some ways to when Israel helped the Barzani forces in the 1960s and 70s. That was only as long as America agreed and that they could reach them through Iran. And when the Algiers Agreement happened in 1975 and Iran pulled the plug on assistance to the Iraqi Kurdish revolt against Baghdad, and then Israel could not continue on its own to assist them, not when Washington was saying no, and not when they couldn't access the area. Well, it's the same essential dynamic. The Druze are one thing. They're right on Israel's border. Even if America says something else, and Tel Aviv pissed off Washington when it bombed Damascus, Ministry of Defense, and so forth, and to protect the Druze in Sawida, they can do that. But how do they reach the Kobani or Kamishli? Do they send Israeli aircraft right on the Turkish border and risk a war with Turkey? That's not going to happen. Do they do it despite the fact that, the U.S. is saying, this is our airspace and we are not giving you the green light? That can't happen either. So did Syrian Kurds have some false hopes regarding what Israel could and would do for them? Possibly. I believe the Israelis behind closed doors tried to convince the Americans, but look, they can't even convince the Americans to keep Qatar and Turkey off the board of peace for Gaza. One shouldn't overplay their influence there.
For many Kurds, what's been happening in Syria lately, it feels like another turning point. As you said, they took enormous pride in what they call the Rojava Revolution, a project that energized Kurdish nationalism across the region. But that experiment is rapidly unraveling, do you think this will ultimately what's happened in Syria will ultimately weaken Kurdish nationalism or strengthen it?
I think so far it's strengthened Kurdish nationalism. Uh, Kobani became quite the symbol. As you mentioned before, in the past, Rojava was like the forgotten fourth part of Kurdistan. Without mountains and without a history of revolts and valiant deeds against the central government, it was hard to really view Rojava the same way as you would the other parts of Kurdistan. But starting in 2004, and then really with Kobani, it became symbolic, as you mentioned, for all of Kurdistan. And, when I lived in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, I used to watch Kurdish music videos on television. There were so many about Kobani and the heroic resistance. It became, suddenly it was like Rojava reached the same level as Bashur, as Bakur, as Rojalat, and so forth. And again, in the last couple of weeks, when it came under threat, we saw all the different political parties of Kurdistan, including some in Iraqi Kurdistan who have been at odds politically with, the PYD in Rojava, all come together and say, no, this can't happen. We have to defend Rojava. And we saw volunteers coming. We saw even, the most stalwart opponents of, the whole PKK-aligned movement. I was in Erbil last month, and I was talking to them, and they were asking me, okay, what can we do to help Rojava and so forth? These were not, followers of Apo or Erdogan and so forth. This was just Kurdish nationalism in terms of 2 + 2 = 1, the one Kurdistan, and it was remarkable to see. So these kinds of difficulties increase Kurdish nationalism, even if in the short term they hurt the practical situation of Kurds and others looking for self-determination in the region. And so I also think that this is a word of caution for Ankara, for Damascus in particular, because I think they realize that it could get out of control for them as well. When you have Kurds in Nusaybin crossing over to Kamishli to volunteer, whoa, that's interesting.
Just to that point, you already covered the Iraqi Kurdistan part of the story, but I remember when the fighting between Damascus and the SDF escalated in January, I spoke with people from Turkey's pro-Kurdish party, DEM party, and they told me something striking, just like you said. They said, many young Kurds on this side of the border in Turkey are ready to head to Syria to join the fight and support the SDF. So this is also another sign that what's happening in Syria is mobilizing Kurds across the region and boosting Kurdish nationalism. I want to switch gears to talk about where U.S. stands here. I mean, there's been deep Kurdish frustration with the Trump administration. Many Kurds feel outright betrayed, watching Washington stand by as Damascus moved against the SDF and the Kurdish autonomous Kurdish project began to unravel. One Kurdish official told me, if there were a different president in the White House, none of this would have happened. So I want to ask you about that. I mean, do you agree if someone like, let's say, Kamala Harris were the president, do you think Syrian Kurds would still be holding onto their autonomy today?
Well, the counterfactuals and the hypotheticals are always difficult, but it's a bit ironic. Like, I mean, I think a lot of Kurds were very excited about Trump originally because his maverick image. He's going to break with old ways of doing things. And so in their mind, he was like, maybe he's going to break with the old U.S. State Department approach to the Kurdish issue, which was never particularly positive for the Kurds. In contrast to the Pentagon, which is different and is happy to work with them, values them. The view was, the foreign policy establishment of the U.S., especially the State Department and the old mavens of foreign policy there were never in the Kurdish camp. They were always Arabists and Tyrannists and Persianists and so forth. But the record so far, after 2 terms now, is that Trump has been the worst U.S. president for the Kurds in recent history by far. Like, it was Obama who did the airlift drops of material for Kobani and also intervened in Iraq to stop ISIS's advance towards Erbil in August of 2014. And what they've seen from the Trump administration has looked like just betrayal after betrayal. And in some sense, that's to be expected in a foreign policy that values economic interest, political power. Well, guess what? The capitals of neighboring states are always more wealthy and more politically powerful than the Kurds. If you don't work into the equation any norms or commonality of outlooks, the fact that Kurds are much more pro-American than other groups, if that doesn't matter because you're not interested in norms, then you throw them under the bus. As we've seen, it looks like Tom Barak and Trump have been doing, and Trump in 2019 with the withdrawal and the Turkish invasion. I don't know how much better, but it's hard not to think it would have been better under Kamala Harris or another administration. Also, another Republican administration, it would have been better. Like I think I mentioned Lindsey Graham's Save the Kurds Act. The Republican Party, along with the Democratic Party in general, is very pro-Kurdish. They value what the Kurds have done. I gave an interview this morning. I did an hour-long interview with a Christian podcaster based here in Springfield, Missouri, that broadcasts all across the U.S., and I brought up the Kurdish issue for them, and they were like, oh yeah, the Kurds, they're our allies. I'm like, well, we've kind of just thrown them under the bus. And they're like, that's terrible. And these were very supportive groups for the Trump administration, and so they're not in line with that.
Although David, I mean, let's also remember that the Biden administration as well was, facilitating these talks and asking the SDF to integrate into Syrian national institutions. And to me, from the get-go, it was clear. I believed American officials when they said our cooperation with the SDF is tactical. We're not going to be there forever. I believe them. And also, there is this one more thing to add to this. I think there is this mood in the region, and it seems like regional countries like Turkey, Saudis, and others are all in line with and President Trump. This notion that this is a time, particularly following October 7th, this is a time when we need to strengthen central governments against these non-state actors. Obviously, Kurds are a minority, but I'm talking specifically about the Syrian Democratic Forces. So I think that's why I don't think things would have been a whole lot different had there been a different president for the Kurds.
It's quite true that from the beginning, the Americans were saying we're not promising an open-ended, permanent. This isn't South Korea where we're going to stay for like 70 years or something like that. But if the administration in northeast Syria had said, "Look, we just want federalism," like you have in the US, like you have in Canada, like you have in Switzerland, in Belgium. That would have been a very understandable message. And they said, just back us for federalism. We're not saying you have to leave your troops here, but, the whole centralized mantra, it's kind of been tried for a long time in the region. And maybe that's actually why you have groups like ISIS and the Syrian civil war and others. And maybe it's time to follow a different model. I think that could have had some resonance. It would have been harder to ignore. So I think there's two sides to this story.
Good points. I want to zoom out and ask what regional developments mean for Kurdish communities beyond Syria, especially in states with large Kurdish minorities like Turkey, and then you have Iraq, Iran. And let me start with Iraq. Baghdad and Kurdistan regional government are once again trying to work through long-running disputes over energy exports, budget transfers, and revenue sharing. And I think if you look at Iraq today, two developments stand out. First is Iraq is heading into elections this year. And second, Ankara and Baghdad, under Prime Minister Soudani, have been building much closer ties, right? From cooperation against the PKK to energy and major infrastructure projects. So what does all of this mean for the Kurdistan regional government? Does it strengthen its position vis-a-vis Baghdad or leave it more vulnerable?
It's always a bit hard to say. During Maliki's last term as prime minister, relations were not good with Ankara, and that very much worked to Erbil's advantage when he was looking for alternative oil pipeline outlets and so forth. As you note, Baghdad and Ankara are getting along much better now, and they're going to be renewing the treaty for the Kirkuk-Ceyhan oil pipeline this year. They have to do it by this summer, I believe. And if they're getting along well, it seems less likely that it's going to be renewed in a way that gives Erbil much wiggle room, whereas it might have been different otherwise. But as long as the Kurdish parties in Iraq can continue to play the political game in Baghdad, as long as there's divisions amongst Shiites, not just between Shiites and Sunnis, but different Shiite parties and others, they have ways to pursue their interests. And no Iraqi prime minister is going to want to completely alienate like the KDP, which is technically the largest political party in Iraq in terms of number of voters. Seats is a whole different story with the way it was arranged. So it's a complicated game, and it's a reminder that to secure their part of Kurdistan, the Kurds in Iraq have to be present in Baghdad.
What about the Kurds in Iran? The regime there is under unprecedented strain right now, with nationwide protests and crackdowns. So do you think that current vulnerability of the Iranian regime could open up more space for Iranian Kurds to press for greater rights and freedoms?
Absolutely. It's almost a truism of Kurdish politics that when central governments experience crises and collapse and weakness, that's your moment to get more self-determination, even without seceding or anything like that. Like, it doesn't have to be the Republic of Kurdistan in Mahabad in 1945 or something, but you could push for the kind of rights at a minimum that many communities enjoy throughout the world that Kurds have been denied, savagely denied, in Iran as well. The problem is the the lack of a cohesive Iranian opposition and any substantive alternative Persian movements that recognize Kurdish or Azeri or Baluch or Lor rights in Iran. That conversation hasn't happened. Like, I mean, before the overthrow of Saddam, we had the Iraqi National Congress. Now, this was a meeting of Iraqi opposition groups, both Kurdish and Arab, and they had meetings in London, and they kind of fleshed out that Iraq after Saddam was going to be federal, and they all got behind it. Now, the INC had lots of problems with Ahmed al-Chalabi and so on, but that's a separate issue. That was later on, and I don't want to get into that. But just the whole exercise of mapping out what the relationship is going to be between the different groups, it facilitated the transition in Iraq. And for various reasons, it hasn't happened in Iran. I don't think the Western powers, the US, Europe, and others, have done enough to facilitate it. Because surely the only two options are not, the Islamic Republic or the Pahlavis, the Shah's son. There's got to be better options than that. And they haven't done the groundwork. And what's left is the Iranian regime plays on the fears of Persian oppositions that they have of groups like the Kurds, and it plays on the Kurds' fear of, Persian nationalists to divide them all. And to make sure that there's no credible alternative to replace the current regime in Tehran, which even if you get millions of protesters out in the streets, it's very difficult when it doesn't look like there's enough of an alternative, and when some people in Tehran are afraid of what the Kurds might ask for.
I always find it very interesting that the Iranian Kurds, they always remain under the radar in Western coverage of Iran, right? I guess it's maybe because we have bigger problems, so we have the regime to focus on. Finally, what do you think this regional moment means for Turkey's Kurds? The Turkish government has launched a new initiative involving the PKK's imprisoned leader Abdullah Öcalan. The government is trying to disarm and ultimately dismantle the PKK. But it's still unclear what Kurds are being offered in return. And even if Erdogan does promise reforms or expanded rights, there's real skepticism about whether he would actually follow through. So where does all of this leave Turkey's Kurds now in their long struggle for rights and freedoms?
I think the big problem here is that the Turkish state has not reciprocated in any way to the PKK's acceptance of Öcalan's call for disarming and a peace process. So it's a very one-sided peace process so far, and that in turn has stopped the PKK from going further than a little symbolic ceremony in Sulaimani province of Iraqi Kurdistan of burning some weapons and so forth. They've kind of put the brakes on it, because what are they going to get? Like, I mean, there's a lot of actors in Turkey who seem to think that this is just a de-terrorism process. Yeah. Rather than a peace process. A peace process is going to involve a give and take, right? Like with the IRA and the British government, both sides give something. If you're only expecting one side to surrender, then that's not a peace process. And so the question is, will Turkey miss this opportunity? Will the PKK go back to the guerrilla warfare, or will some new group emerge? Maybe a group that engages in random acts of terrorism. We don't know. And what we saw when the attacks on the Kurds in Syria were occurring in the Sheikh Maksud neighborhood of Aleppo and then in northeast Syria, in the other parts, was that it was riling up the Kurdish population in Turkey. And I think that worked into maybe Turkey's calculation to allow Damascus to at least make some concessions about, for Kurdish divisions and Kurdish education rights, because it was starting to look like it could roll out of control. Turkey has a finite window to reciprocate in this peace process, and they need Öcalan. No one else has his stature or his credibility to get his side of the table to observe concessions and compromises and lay down weapons. If he wasn't there, who would they be talking to? There are other leaders, but no one has his stature. So they better hope he lives long enough to carry this forward, and they have to help him by reciprocating.
Although, David, that seems to be the calculation on the Turkish government's part that, we have Öcalan and we're going to use him as much as we can. But on the other hand, I think with everything going on in Syria, there's a lot of pressure on Öcalan. It's really, I think it's undermining his credibility as well, because one of the things that he said from the get-go was that when this whole peace process was launched, he said, I'm very close to Mazlum Abdi in Syria. He's like a son, and I have, I can make things happen. And he was urging the SDF to implement the March 10 deal. That hasn't really happened. So that kind of undercuts his influence, credibility, and his leverage. And then there's the Kurdish street in Turkey. Just today, I was talking to someone from Diyarbakir, which is this Kurdish majority town in Turkey, and he said, Kurds are really frustrated with Öcalan and also the DEM party, because they feel like the grand bargain that was being offered was, okay, the PKK is going to withdraw from Turkey and then disband and disarm, and in return that we were going to keep what we had achieved in Syria, and that's not the case anymore. So this puts a lot of pressure on both Öcalan and the pro-Kurdish party in Turkey. And maybe another word about this whole Öcalan process. You're right. The government was very deliberately framing it as disarming and disbanding the PKK. So one would often wonder, Kurdish question is not just a terrorism problem. Obviously, it's a matter of democratization and human rights. So how are you going to address that part?
I think Öcalan very much was cognizant of what you just pointed out, because I heard a statement from him that if they go after the Kurds in Syria and massacre them and so forth, he's going to stop calling for disarmament of even the PKK, that it's over. The whole process is over. So I think he knows that.
Yes, sure. But short of that, I definitely agree. In fact, I recently wrote a piece making the same argument. I think he will go along with whatever arrangement is being made between Damascus and the SDF, as long as there is no massacre of Kurds. So maybe going full circle here, the success, quote-unquote success of this Öcalan process, it all also depends on what will happen in Syria between Damascus and the Kurds there. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Dr. David Romano, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.